Hello and welcome, my name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be reading through and getting under the legs of the latest Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 425, Behind the Legs. Posted by Strangepan and Erendel. Hello, make way for the Pentapods. Last week, Friday Facts 424, we announced two entirely new enemies coming to Factorio Space Age, Stompers and Strafers. This week we're going to take you on a behind-the-scenes tour of some of the features, systems and optimizations that brought these adorable monsters to life. We'll also talk about the techniques we used to prepare last week's announcement. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's dive right in. So first off, I thought we introduced three new enemies. Wrigglers, Stompers and Strafers. I guess Wrigglers are basically just reskinned biters in a sense, so they're probably not really different in the way that Stompers and Strafers are. The other thing then is I would echo that this is quite a long one. It is quite a techie one. You know I love the techie ones, so I'm in heaven reading this through. But so if that's not your cup of tea, then there are timestamps, so you can skip between the things you might find interesting. I would recommend the part where Arendor talks about doing the video. That's quite interesting in and of itself. But otherwise, I'll just talk about the few bits of speculation I've got towards the end. Starting with optimizations. From the very beginning, we knew we wanted Pentapods to reuse the code that drives Spidertron legs, but we also knew that Spidertron had some performance issues. If we could not solve the issues, then adding Pentapods to Factorio would really harm UPS. Even though premature optimizations are usually a bad idea, we had very little choice in the matter. In order to bring Pentapods to life, I first needed to optimize Spidertron. I guess just to mention the reason that one of the reasons that doing early optimizations is bad is simply because of the fact that it might change. You might throw out that entire area of code, you might completely rewrite it, you might rework functions, etc, etc. So if you optimize it too early, one of the problems is that you've then done a load of work that you may just be throwing away. So, I mean, there are other reasons for it, but let's not get into those. But basically, one of the reasons is, there's no point optimizing something that you might be going to get rid of. But you've kind of got the reverse situation here, in that the issues they go on to explain about how Spidertron pathing was working, etc., meant that it was not a very efficient part of the code, and that if you start introducing enemies that use that code a lot, you're basically just stacking up poor performance issues. So, one of my interpretations of that is that before they even gave Pentapods the big tick, as it were, to go ahead, they needed to know that they could make Spidertron code, the leg code, a lot better. So they were kind of forced to do optimization a lot earlier than they probably would have ideally done. Deduplicating work. The most obvious performance problem with Spidertrons happened when they navigated over obstacles. In 1.1, you can observe a noticeable slowdown by commanding a squad of Spidertrons to cross a wide river. In some saves, as few as 10 Spidertrons could affect UPS. Personally, I've never noticed an issue with Spidertrons and slowdown. I guess that's because when you're using them, you're at a stage where you've got a lot of stuff anyway, and maybe if you're getting slowdown, you're probably thinking that it's just, well, I've got 10,000 trains or what have you, so 100,000 inserters, so that's all the stuff that's causing slowdown. So maybe I've just not noticed it because other slowdown was, overlapping, because I say, Spidertron is very much a late game thing, so you've probably got a fairly big factory anyway. I would also say, I don't know that I've ever really used 10 Spidertrons. Maybe as an absolute limit in when I did my Mega Base series, but they're so powerful and so useful that just a couple, you only really need a couple of landfill ones and a couple of combat ones and a couple of builder ones and you're done. So that's 6 maybe? Well, I guess also plus a personal one. And of course they won't be moving around all at the same time is the other thing. You won't have a squad of 10 Spidertrons unless you're really going for it, moving across, all in the same direction. So yeah, I suppose I've never really got to a stage where perhaps I noticed that UPS slowdown. The first culprit that I found was the algorithm searched for an empty space to place each leg. In 1.1, the algorithm scans in an outward spiral, checking every 1/5 of a tile for collisions with a tile, i.e. water, or entity in that location, in an area up to 16 by 16 tiles. In the worst case, where there are no empty spaces, this algorithm conducts around 6,400 collision checks. So, the 6,400, I didn't quite twig that... So basically, the maths on that is that it's an 8-tile radius. I hadn't twigged that, of course, you use diameter basically. So the radius is like the the short side, and then it's double that. So it's basically a 16 tile diameter, which is what it's saying there. So it's a 16 by 16 tiles. So it's the ultimate diameter of the spiral would be the full width. So it's then 16 tiles, and it's doing a fifth of that. So you divide it by 0.2. Another way of saying that would be multiplied by 5. So that then gets you 80 essentially. And then of course that's diameter. So basically you're doing it as a square. So you need to multiply it by both sides. So it becomes 80 by 80, which is 6,400. This one here that's shown, and it's what confused me actually, this is half size basically. So this would be a 8 by 8. So that's a 4 tile radius basically. So yeah. So just explain that, because I say it confused the heck out of me how that maths was working. But yes, so you can kind of see that if it starts in the middle here and it searches every single one of these tiles in a spiral pattern, and because it's all water, it's going to come up and say nope every single time. So it's just going to keep going and keep going. Presumably it stops when it reaches a point where it finds somewhere it can put a leg. Oh, one of the things to note, of course, it's looking for several exclusion things. So it's looking for water, but also if there's a building there, or, I guess presumably elevated rails or something might have an impact on that now. But I think it can stand on rail pieces like anywhere on a rail piece, so that's fine. There might be trees. I don't think it can stand on trees as such. So there are various things that it's going to check for to see whether it can actually stand there. So as you can see, it's doing a heck of a lot of checks is the basic point. And the caption on this just says, all of the positions a Spidertron's leg checks for collision. This example shows 1600 checks, but this isn't even the worst possible case. Also not illustrated is the fact that every single leg on the Spidertron is performing this check every single tick. So the Spidertron obviously has 8 legs, and so you're literally doing 8 times 6,400 in the absolute worst case scenario. So this is where you've path found it up to the edge of a bit of water, and it's trying to find places where it can stand, and that's just an entire body of water, so it can't stand on any of it. But it's still doing that check every single tick. You can kind of see why therefore it probably has a UPS impact. The trick for solving this was realising that the scan precision is very small, 0.2 tiles. Tiles are 5 times this size, and most entities are at least 10 times this size. Therefore, the algorithm often checks the same tile or entity over and over again. Instead, if the algorithm finds a collision, it should immediately advance past the edge of the collider's bounding box, and if we remember every collider's bounding box, we could potentially skip scanning entire rows and columns. What that's referring to is the fact that you see on this here, these look like these are half tiles. Okay, these look like these are cutaway pieces from the tile, so that the actual part that you can stand on is only that section there. That's not true. That's a graphical thing that they do. And basically every single tile, I'm pretty sure, maybe I am wrong on this, but pretty sure that every tile is a solid thing. And they do this just to give it a nice coastal appearance so that it doesn't, it's not like a Minecraft blocky style thing. And that's why when you often get, landfill being put down and tile entities on it, it's a lot sort of sharper and clearer, because those do have very fixed edges. And you can even see it here. Obviously the landfill is that part there, and then it's got this crinkly line here. This isn't a standable area in a sense. There probably is just a slight edge that it can stand on. But this isn't, a half filled in tile, because there is no such thing. So in other words, checking all of these points in between is sort of a bit pointless. It makes more sense when you've got trees and stuff, that they don't block an entire tile. You can go between them. But the other thing to remember, and what it's really talking about, is that if you found a solar panel, so if this is a point, this here, this little circle here, that is a place where you cannot stand, okay? But that therefore the entire box there, the entire box there, the entire box there, the entire box there are basically skippable in your search. You do not have to search there and there and there and there and there to look for places, because you've found a solar panel that is 3 by 3. So in other words, you can just shortcut past those and say, right, well, okay, can't stand on any of this block. Can I stand on any of the edges? And obviously, as we say, because this is an entity that has a a lot of the entities have how you get past a lot of entities, and why you can't get past others is that they'll either completely occupy the tile, or there'll be like a little edge room just for you to stand on. Because you in here could come in and walk around this edge as well. But that's because that entity allows that. Some other entities don't allow that. So you can know, based on what entity type it is and what you're looking at, whether or not it would be skippable and which bits would be skippable. So you don't have to search every tile, basically. So the caption on the picture says, "The Spidertron's leg checks far fewer positions now. This example shows about 70 collision checks. Also note the new scan pattern, which produces better results compared to the spiral. This change alone significantly improved Spidertron's performance, but the job was not done yet. We'd need to free up many more compute cycles before pentapods were feasible." Shared knowledge is power. The second performance culprit was that every single Spidertron leg in a group was performing the same empty space search in roughly the same area. Even if each individual leg was conducting fewer collision checks, multiple nearby legs would still duplicate this work. This naturally raises a question: can spider legs work together to perform fewer searches? So basically if you've got 8 legs all doing this search, leg 1 has already established that, there's a solar panel here, no need to check it. Having that knowledge passed on to the other checks is going to save a lot of time, basically, because if you know that these are all blocked squares, then no need to check them for any of the legs. The trick to making this work was realising that the algorithm scans outward from the centre until the first empty space is found. That means if we find an empty position some tiles away from the search origin, we know that the inside square is completely blocked. If we mark this inner square as a search exclusion zone and put it in a list, future leg searches can check that list and skip collision checks that fall within that zone. So if I'm the search algorithm and I've decided all of these are unviable spots because it's water, I can stick that in a list, and every other leg that follows, as it were. There's some weird phrasing in this Friday Facts. It's all going to get a bit strange. But the leg checks that follow can say, right, well, we already know that's water, I'm not going to check it again. The only sort of caveat to that, when you think about it, and it works because it's done every tick, but the only caveat to that is you could deconstruct these buildings, or a bot could, or an alien could blow them up, or what have you. So I guess you could just store the water ones. That would be one way of doing it. But if you're deciding, there's a building here, I can't stand here, and then I deconstruct the building in the interim, actually you can stand there. So I'm assuming that because it's checking it every tick and they're storing the list every tick, that sort of doesn't matter, because you're not going to really care if your Spidertron decides it can't stand there one tick and then can stand there next tick. That's 1/60th of a second. So caption on this one says, after searching an area for empty space, that area is logged as a search exclusion zone for the remainder of the tick. Other Spidertron legs will skip over this entire zone when they also search for an empty space. So the other thing I didn't note on all of these, there's like debug type graphics, I think. I don't think these are just drawn on for the purposes of this, that are basically showing you, so this leg is saying, right, can I stand somewhere, basically. So this is it trying to say, can I stand somewhere? And that its target position is that one. So these legs would all like to stand in these positions, and that's the origin for their search. So, because that's just where its vertical projection is down onto the surface. So it wants to stand there. So that's where its search is starting. And then where it's actually finding somewhere to stand is there, basically. So what's actually being represented here is that it's going through all of these checks, and why this stops at, half the size of the maximum check. It's going through all of these checks until it finally finds it here, and you can actually see the sort of spiral path that's, say, almost certainly a square spiral. And then here it's doing all of those checks in that pathing. I don't know what order it goes through those. Presumably it still does it like outward outward circles, basically. But then it still finds the same place to stand. And then here, these basically are being marked as red. And so these ones which are trying to find a place to start, this one, and this one, when it does its check, it's going to just completely ignore all of those and go to the, the first ones that are viable that aren't already marked. And presumably then, because it's done in a list way and it's going through each leg in turn, it will start marking these as not viable, and other ones will ignore that, basically. Because you notice also, the other thing I didn't mention is we have numbers. So they're showing you which is like the next leg to do. Being programmers, it obviously starts at 0. So it's 0, 1, which is 2. This must be 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So 8. Honestly, I had little hope for this to work. The implementation is very naive, and the exclusion zones are only valid for the tick they are added. But to my surprise, this little hack cut down a ton of time. After a few more adjustments and other optimizations, pentapods were now feasible and can be added to the expansion. My guess on why it adds more than you'd expect time benefit is because you're talking about 8 legs. So the difference between all, and as I say, presumably it adds on. So this second leg, it blocks all of those out, that blocks all of those out, and suddenly the search that your last leg is doing is like those 2 tiles. Yeah, so that's an enormous cut down from doing that, basically, even as it says, even if it is in a naive, simplistic way. A new walking algorithm. The final performance culprit that we'll discuss involves the algorithm that selects which Spidertron leg gets to move. You see, for all the improvements made to the empty space search algorithm, there was still a glaring inefficiency. Every leg, no matter if it was already moving or waiting on a moving neighbour, was searching for an empty space every tick while the Spidertron was walking. Each leg was assigned a score based on how far the leg needed to step, and only one leg with the highest score was chosen to move. If that leg was already busy moving, then the results were simply thrown away. So basically, as it turns out, that it's doing all of this checking for places to stand. But you see here, so this one, I guess that one has got the longest to move, because it would have been there, and then its sort of movement, position where it wants to go to, say it's there to there, and presumably that was the longest one. But anyway, it gets to it and it says, right, well, which of these legs has got the furthest to move? Try to move that leg. So I guess in this case, it would try and move that one. But if it's already moving, it then just dumps everything. So it does all of that checking and says, well, the leg's already in motion. Get rid of it all. So it's doing an enormous amount of work to basically just throw it in the bin. Interesting. Obviously, this resulted in many wasted searches, but it was necessary to ensure that the Spidertron always made progress towards its destination. Without this scoring system, legs that needed to take a big step would often get stuck because one or both neighbouring legs were busy taking small, repeated steps. What we needed was an efficient way to ensure that every leg had an equal opportunity to move. The solution to this problem came about months later while the pentapods were in early development. When the 5-legged pentapods were added, the old algorithm for scoring and moving legs was no longer adequate. Arundel wanted complete control over the order in which legs moved so that we could give these alien creatures a unique and organic walking pattern. This gave me the excuse I needed to overhaul the Spidertron walking algorithm and implement the final major optimization. How should a creature with 5 legs walk? We don't have many good examples on Earth, but Arundel still came up with a good design. To maintain balance and stability, pentapods step in a 5-pointed star pattern. So here we see that then. So we've got, after all legs in group 1 have finished stepping, legs in group 2 can start stepping. Afterwards, groups 3, then 4, then 5. Some pentapods, however, prefer to count backwards. Interesting. I guess that gives them a different type of movement style. But the groupings are because with Spidertron, clearly they wanted it to move in a in a balanced way. It doesn't do that at the moment, obviously, because that algorithm is saying move the leg that's got to move the furthest, so it'll move whatever leg. But they're clearly wanting to shift it more towards a... a lot of animals really actually do this, that have multiple legs, in that they move, pairs of legs on either side at the same time. So this is going... So you notice how Spidertron here only actually has 2 groups. So legs in group 1 and legs in group 2 will each move at the same time. So in other words, it's sort of doing I can't do it with my fingers, but if it's in the middle, then legs 1 and 1 are move, and legs 2 and 2 move, and legs 1 and 1 move, and legs 2 and 2 move. So it's more like that rippling. You see it on centipedes. Centipedes are a good example, where the sort of leg movement ripples down the animal as it puts the legs forward. This is interesting, and what it basically means is that they're then given 5 groups, and so actually they're just 5 completely independent limbs, and so it can move that one, then that one, then that one, then that one, then that one. Because one of the things I didn't mention last week that I completely failed to mention was there's obviously a bit of a similarity here, and there always was with Spidertron, to the tripods in War of the Worlds. So they obviously have 3 legs, but 5 and 3 are both, uneven prime numbers. So, they have to move legs independently, basically. You can't rely on necessarily, you can do a sort of a 2 and a 3 and a 2 and a 3 type movement, but essentially an independent movement for every leg is a little bit more stable and balanced. And so that's what these guys are doing. They're doing independent movements. But I guess in order to give them sort of visual distinction and a bit less sort of uniformity and interchangeability, one of them goes backwards and one of them goes forwards. So one will move. So, for example, if this guy is the forwards, it'll move its back legs first. Yeah? And if this is the backwards order, I guess in this, if it was moving north rather than south, then it would be moving its top leg first. So it would be reaching out. I guess the difference is if you move a back leg, then you're sort of hunching yourself up and propelling yourself forward. Whereas if you move a front leg, you are reaching forward and pulling yourself forward. So it's going to give a different feel to the movement, basically. To implement this, every leg on a pentapod or a Spidertron is assigned a numbered walking group. When walking, one or more legs from the current walking group are selected to move. These selected legs search for a clear destination and then begin moving there. No more wasted searches. After all, the legs of the current walking group have finished stepping, or at least moved past some specified threshold, which I won't be able to cover today. The process repeats for the next walking group. The new system significantly cuts down on the number of collision checks, while giving designers unprecedented control over Spidertron and Pentapod walking animations. After these 3 leg optimizations, and several other smaller ones we don't have time for, Spidertrons are now far less taxing on UPS. In a test save designed to stress Spidertron mobility, I measured an average of 53.56% fewer milliseconds per update, which is approximately 2.15 times faster. So, in Factorio 2.0, players should now be able to command larger armies of Spidertrons without obliterating their UPS, although results may vary. I mean, this is a kind of unstated thing, but if we're getting, 5 new planets, and I would imagine you're probably not going to want to take every Spidertron with you when you move between planets, your combat ones, your building ones, your landfill ones, you're not going to want to move all of those about every time you move planet. And also, if we're doing everything remotely, you're going to want to leave them there. But you could easily set, 5 jobs going for 5 different groups, and then this 10 Spidertrons number as being an impact on UPS. Where was it? 10 Spidertrons could affect UPS. That in Space Age, I could easily imagine would be achievable. It's something, as I say, I've probably never really done in my playthroughs, but you've got 5 planets, so 10 Spidertrons is perfectly, reasonable. That's only 2 Spidertrons per planet. So that's a lot of impact for something that you're probably going to want even more than that of. You'd probably want 3 or 4 per planet late game. So you're then talking, double, treble that number of Spidertrons just on a normal playthrough. And you could easily queue up lots of jobs for them, is the point. You could send out your combat ones, you could send out your builders, you could send out your landfills, get them doing a load of stuff. You can queue up loads and loads of movement, so we know these things can just be doing stuff in the background. Doing that on 5 separate planets is probably perfectly normal behaviour, and so you need that optimisation for them. New enemies, new features. By Strangepan. With new enemies comes new behaviours, and with new behaviours comes new engine features. We'll now discuss the game design decisions that influence the Pentapod designs and the system changes we built to implement them. Pathfinding over obstacles. We knew early on that enclosing your Gleba factory with walls was going to be a real drag on gameplay. So, we designed an enemy that didn't care about puny walls. Instead, players must fend off Pentapod attacks with raw firepower and the new rocket turret. What we haven't seen is whether you can build on the shallow seas, basically, because we know we're getting shallow seas, so where the engineer and the pentapods can move about on them, can you also build on them? Because if you can't, then that means there's an easy way for enemies to traverse around your walls. Even setting, biters, basically. If the enemy was just biters, then if you have shallow seas that they can walk on, but you can't build on, then you've just got an easy route for stuff to get around your walls anyway. Okay, so that's one of the problems that trying to wall yourself in would have, and that would be particularly annoying if your enemies were the biters, basically, because they just come and attack your stuff. There is no subtlety in what they do. If you've got a big gap in your walls, then they'll come through and colonise or attack you. We've not really... I mean, we've kind of seen on the map what we think is probably deeper sea, deeper ocean, as it were, because those would then act as barriers to everything, basically. So, if that's it, water areas that you can't traverse, and the pentapods can't traverse, and the raft things can't go on, your biters can't go on, that would allow you to create choke points. But I say, if you then have shallow sea at the edge of every single deep water, biters can just, go around, The other issue, as I say, is if you've not really got any deep sea and you can build on the shallow sea and you can put your walls down on there or what have you, effectively you get to a situation where you've got to wall in every single tile around your edge, the edge of your base, every single one. And I can tell you from having done that on my SpaceX playthrough, it is an absolute pain in the bum, particularly if you've not got the productivity and production rather to support it. If you've got limited resources and what have you, walling your entire base in is actually really expensive. So the basic point, that was a really long ramble, but the basic point was they wanted to get players to focus in doing things in a different way, not just spam walls all around the edges. To make this work, we needed the Pathfinder to support gaps and produce paths that ignore obstacles. Luckily, I was able to extend the existing biter pathfinding system, talked about in Friday Facts 317, with a few new features. When performing the abstract or chunk level pathfinding, it is no longer sufficient to only record the traversable tiles that touch the chunk's perimeter. In addition, non-traversable tiles along the chunk's perimeter need to record the distance to the nearest traversable tile of up to 2 different components. We later use this information to connect multiple components between chunks. I'm not going to go back to 317 and re-explain that. It was obviously a long time before I was doing these Friday Facts. I do remember reading it, and it is a fascinating read. If you want to kind of work out what that's on about, go and read 317, I'm afraid. This is long enough. I mean, I would give you a quick summary, but this is going to be long enough already. So I'm afraid if you want to dig into that, you'll have to look at it yourself. But the basic point is it stores some various parameters about chunks. The big thick lines here are the chunks, basically, rather than the individual tiles. And the game is done in a... This is basically what a radar scans. A radar scans a chunk when it does a scan. And it does record some information about, what's on the edge of the tile, basically. Because if the tile has all 4 water edges, of course, you're not going to pathfind across it. So it's things like that, basically. The distance between 2 tiles is calculated as the greater value of either delta x or delta y. Caption on this says, traversable tiles within a chunk are grouped together if their distance is less than the maximum allowable gap. Tiles along each chunk's border remember the distance to the nearest traversable tile within the chunk. Note this screenshot does not show an example of an edge tile that is within range of more than one component. Okay, I have to confess the delta x, delta y bit is a little confusing for me because delta x to me means the difference in the x distance and delta y means the difference in the y distance. The trouble with that is that, for example, this tile here has a 6. Now delta x to me would be that distance and delta y would be that distance. So what it actually seems to be recording is that distance, the diagonal, basically. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, and this one 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it does look like it's doing a Pythagoras type, distance of the square type of thing, but remembering it in tile terms rather than an actual distance sort of thing. So I'm not 100% sure what it's talking about with the delta x, delta y. But basically what it's doing is it's saying, right, all of these tiles are traversable, as in they can be stepped on. And because there's a tile next to them that can be traversed, they have a 0 distance to the next traversable tile. So these are actually basically then stuck all in a group, essentially. So if a pathfinding algorithm is coming along and saying, right, where's the nearest traversable tile? At the very least, it knows that it's next to it. Basically, this is what it's telling it. It can go next to it. You've then got, as I say, you've got the thick border represents the edge of the chunk, and each tile on the edge of the chunk is then also remembering the distance to the next traversable tile. So if your pentapod enemy, because these will have different stepping distances, and you can literally see it, your Spidertron and your pentapods and your different types, and we know that, these are the green ones, and we know that there's gold ones and red ones, and that they get bigger, so they have bigger stepping distances. So if you're coming along here as an algorithm and saying, right, you need to be able to step, what it's effectively saying is you need to be able to step 6 tiles in order to reach the next traversable tile, if you're coming in from that into this chunk, basically, to step across. So then smaller pentapods won't be able to make it. Spidertron will be able to make some of them. The giant pentapods are probably not going to be bothered other than by anything except a gigantic, sea, basically. One of the things that is interesting in that, and I can't remember what it talks about in the 317, is about the whole thing that the engineer is able to cross things like that. Because as I was saying before, these aren't actually half-filled tiles. That's 4 water tiles. Biters aren't allowed to cross gaps like that. They wouldn't need to, obviously, on that example, but we are as the engineer. So whether or not it applies that same logic to the pentapods will be an interesting question, because things like the Wrigglers, I'm guessing, may be able to go across small gaps, maybe? But it's really the big guys. So how big do these gaps have to be in order to block their passage? You don't want your passage blocked, that's quite inconvenient. Next, when performing the base, tile level Pathfind, every node must remember if it is traversable and always point back to the last known traversable node. This allows the algorithm to scan deeper into untraversable areas, water, walls and other entities, to find paths that would otherwise be impossible for biters to traverse. And here we see the pathfinding arrow in action, and the caption says, nodes search some distance into untraversable terrain, always pointing back towards the last known traversable tile. A typical pathfind searches many more nodes than this illustration shows. So what that's doing, so this is the path that it's deciding on. Okay, and you'll have to go back to 317 to really kind of dig into these. But this solid one is the path that it's deciding on. The sort of lighter ones are where it's checking potential options, basically. And this is basically saying, right, well, we could step to all of these, but they're not traversable tiles. But it's then able to check using this to say, well, where is the nearest traversable tile? And so this then allows it to both find, the place where it can step, but also in this process, and I'm guessing what talking about not showing them, is that, it could check here and say, no, but I'm 3 tiles away from somewhere you can step. And so it looks 3 tiles away and says, well, could I reach that? And then it'll say, oh no, that's 5 steps away. Okay, well, 3 plus 5 is 8, so can I step 8? So it's basically trying to check to see, all right, well, I can't actually step here. Can I step closer to, can I step somewhere similar, basically, or somewhere nearby? And so that allows it then to say, right, well, how far into this is a proper block on a pentapod? And presumably it has different, criteria it uses. So it's basically saying, because notice here it's got a solid blob, and it's saying it could step here, but the path I want to make is this one. And so this is a more efficient step because I'm actually sort of moving 1 tile further closer to where I want to go. And this, presumably, is just slightly too far. So this, whatever this is, maybe it's a green strafer, can step this far, but it can't step that far. So that distance is its maximum, and then it can't get there. I'm guessing actually probably it's just culled that, so effectively it's found a place to step and not bothered checking there. But yeah, it's that type of algorithm you're talking about, where it's basically finding a good enough path in order for the the parameters of the actual thing that's moving. So they're clearly not going to allow pentapods, spidertrons to step on walls, but they can step over walls. So where are the tiles where it can step? And this one, as I say, has obviously been flagged as water. They got to remember there's this thing of, as I say, that edges are fluid. Sometimes you can step on an edge, sometimes you can't step on an edge. So this wouldn't have been any blocker because if it can do that distance, it can do that distance. But you get the point, sort of thing. Discontiguous pathfinding will be available via the modding API in Factorio 2.0, even though nothing in the base game currently makes use of it. Spores in the air. I can just see the wiggling leg on the bottom here, and it's quite distracting. Now that the walls can't keep pentapods out, the player has another problem. Pentapods could still attack any part of your factory from any direction. What is an engineer to do except surround the factory with more turrets and weapons? This was still not the strategy we wanted for our players, so we needed to make this strategy unnecessary. To accomplish that, we changed how pollution works on Gleba. So the basic point was, if you can't put walls on, isn't the answer just to stick more and more turrets on? Is it not just therefore the solution that instead of having walls, you have like infinite turrets, 5 deep lasers and then 3 deep flamer turrets, and just absolutely saturate with them, and a huge field of mines outside of that. So the accidental knock-on of this could have been that it encouraged people to put more turrets on because they couldn't use walls. But that's not what they were really going for. They wanted to encourage different strategic solutions. Enemy units, biters and pentapods alike, typically choose attack targets based on pollution. When an attack party is formed, they pathfind towards the nearest chunk with a locally maximum level of pollution and attack the entities in that chunk that are emitting pollution. Pollution works differently on Gleba than on other planets. Some machines that produce high amounts of pollution on Nauvis should emit no pollution on Gleba, while machines that produce high amounts of pollution on Gleba should emit no pollution on Nauvis. How can we make pentapods prioritise specific parts of your factory without changing biter behaviour? Factorio 2.0 introduces pollutant types. Mods can add different types of pollution. Machines, plants, spawners and tiles can each be configured to emit or absorb different amounts of each pollution type. However, for performance reasons, only one pollutant type can be enabled per surface. Pollution is the default pollutant type for new and existing surfaces that have pollution enabled. In Factorio Space Age, Spores replaces pollution on Gleba. Each pollutant type can have its own name, absorption and emission rates, chart colour and more. Armed with this new tool, we were able to tune Gleba so that pentapods focus their aggression on a few specific buildings while functionally ignoring the bulk of the factory. That is, as long as they are not provoked. Redesigned legs. Finally, pentapod legs needed a rework. Being an organic creature, we wanted to minimise the amount of each leg stretched and squished, and instead emphasise bending at the knee and hip. This makes the creature look and feel more believable and less robotic. We even made the legs update their sprites based on their orientation relative to the body. This was difficult to get right due to Factorio's perspective and the weird angles, but Virgil and Erendel did an amazing job. The final effect makes these creatures feel more real by keeping the lighting angle consistent and by accounting for the player's perspective at all times. I find this really I find this video more disturbing than the actual animations of the thing. They're moving the legs about. It's very strange. Stomper and Strafer legs attempt to flex at the hips and knees before stretching. Sprites change based on orientation. They are doing stretch, and you can see it when it pulls it out here. It is sort of stretching it and cheating it, but what it prioritises in the animation is bending this knee joint basically. So say if we loop back round this bit here, the first bit that changes is that knee bends and then it stretches it in order to make it work basically, because it actually has a very short gait, so it wouldn't actually be able to cover great distances. I suppose it's also fairly realistic in that, as you reach out, maybe you can extend the tendons and stuff and reach it, but they're faking that with just squishing or stretching the thing itself. But yeah, I find this moving the legs around really quite freaky. I don't know why. Because Spidertrons and Pentapods share a lot of code, Spidertrons now also have a slightly new look. The legs are less stiff, more bendy, and frankly a little more creepy. They are still clearly robotic entities, so I believe they've managed to preserve their iconic look while also giving them a small facelift. So we'll watch this animation through. So the left side is the Spidertron walking animation in 1.1, and the right side is Spidertron walking animation in 2.0. So this is the new version on the right, this is the old version on the left. One of the things with this is really different, I would say, when it gets to like obstacles. It's still roughly, and it's also seems to look different when it's going up and down. This is still sort of doing the whole, pairs of legs moving thing, but in a much rougher way. Here it's very clear that, sets of legs are moving together on either side of the Spidertron. So if you watch these moving, you see how it's very much more like a repeating pattern, a repeating rhythm for the Spidertron. Whereas this is a bit more, so you're still getting the whole opposite ends move type of thing, but it's not quite as coordinated, not quite as rhythmical in a sense. Whereas here it really does look, and this is very apparent when you do the up and down movement. You see how you've got random legs all crossing over and stuff here, and whereas it's more consistent as to which legs are crossing over in which order. And I say when it gets to this little bit of lake here, that's very different. That's a very different way of doing things, because you've then got pairs of legs like supporting each other on the side, whereas this is it was always the slightly weird thing when you saw a Spidertron trying to cross a narrow bit of water, where particularly when it was a pretty big bit of body of water, it would kind of get to the edge and sort of lean across, which was obviously the search algorithm doing its thing. It would lean across and then suddenly one leg would leap over, and then that would then like be the tipping point where it would jump across. Whereas this looks like more like it'll try with pairs of legs like a real creature would, because how it would balance with just one leg to support itself is not really clear. But this looks like it'll probably try and do several at the same time, and so it'll be slightly more realistic, but then also very much more spider-like. A couple of people have pointed out that it's very, the pentapods in particular are very triggering for them. I'm wondering if Spidertron maybe is a bit more triggering for them, because it's now starting to move like an actual organic spider creature, You also get this. I don't know if you did. I should have just left that. You see how the Spidertron has its back end much more squished up, and it's the legs moving forward, whereas this looks like it's the actual core bit, as it were, is supported in the nest of legs, if you see what I mean. So it's more centralised on where the legs are. Behind the Curtain by Arundel. When we were trying to decide what to do for this week's Friday Facts, I made a joke that I could make a Friday Facts on the making of the last Friday Facts. Well, people really seem to like that idea, so here we are. It makes sense. Fans like seeing behind the scenes. Showing how the videos are made is a nice way to show you behind the scenes content without needing to reveal game secrets. Most Friday Facts, like this one, are made the week of their release. Usually I try to have mine done an extra week in advance, as it's less stressful that way. For the Enemies Friday Facts though, I started working on it many weeks in advance, trying to eliminate all of the unknowns from the production process. I took some of the randomly generated terrain as a combat arena, placed some enemies, and exported it as a scenario, the same way anyone can from the map editor. From previous videos, I already had some performance capture code for capturing player input for character running and for tank controls, turning, acceleration, etc. I extended that system to also capture player weapons input, which is mostly which weapon is selected, whether it's firing or not, and the target position. Here's the character loadout. Weapon damage upgrades are at level 8. Crikey. I'll come back to this. This is quite revealing as to how powerful these enemies are going to be. I recorded a performance of fighting the enemies in the arena, and then I applied that performance back to the scenario, ran it again, and it played out differently. All of the player input was the same, but the enemies didn't do the same things. Some wandered to different positions, and so they attacked at different times. In the original captured version, there was one strafer on the map, and another one spawned just before the egg raft died. In the version with the script control character, instead of spawning a second strafer, an extra Wriggler was spawned. The Stomper joined the combat much earlier for some reason. The character got slowed by gliding Wrigglers hitting at different times, so the movement was off track, and eventually the character got stuck running into a tree and was quickly stomped to death. So not an ideal start. Running the scenario again did at least cause things to play out exactly the same way, with the character getting stomped on into a tree, so at least it's not re-rolling the entire outcome every time. I started trying to figure out what exactly would or would not cause the outcome of this scenario to be randomised. So I guess just to know, I mean, we've said this a lot of times, Factorio is a very deterministic game. It's very much A follows B, follows C, follows D. It's very much these things happen in these orders. There are some things that randomise. You're also going to get, I would expect, like tiny tipping points. Like it mentions some later on where perhaps a very tiny shift in where a tree is going to cause the algorithm, the pathing algorithm, to come up with a completely different result. And I said it feels a bit like that, random number thing where it kind of suddenly tips one way or the other and it has a massively different result, even though it's a tiny little change. But also you say, there are some things that are RNG in the game, so they are random number generation type things, such as the spawning, presumably. After some testing, I realised that it's just not possible to have the scenario play out the same way as the input recording, because both the recording code and application code themselves are enough to change the outcome, and there's no way around that. That's interesting. It's a bit annoying, but not a huge setback, because I knew that a lot of the landscape was going to change around the arena anyway. It made the most sense to add some other reliable tools to keep the new simulation more stable. So this is getting really into the weeds a bit, but it sounds as well then like they're not doing a sort of a Monte Carlo on their random number. So one of the things you can do when you're modelling is you want to do randomness. You want to have probabilistic things in your model, but you want repeatability. So you want to be able to say, right, well, if this is the starting conditions, the things that happen in this order, and when it hits an RNG, I want it to do exactly the same test on exactly the same number, the randomly generated number. I want that number to be the same. And so what you can do effectively, because computers cannot do random, I've said this loads of times in videos, they can't actually do random. They can do a simulation of a random, and you can either use like the default ones or you can build your own random number generator. But basically, what effectively you've got with random numbers in computers is a list of random numbers, and that algorithm that you produce or that you use that's the default one will always step between the next number in that list. And so what you can do is you can basically fix the starting point of that list, and then your random number generator will always reliably produce the same number, next in the sequence. One thing that can affect that, of course, is if something else is doing random number generation and it's doing it at a different time point. So what you would typically do, you see, is you would isolate the machine running that, repeat cycle basically, and just have it doing that on its own. So it's not trying to do anything else that might change the random number list order basically. And I say you can still get overall randomized results by doing that. It's what's called Monte Carlo basically. Because you're rolling a dice, but you're doing so in a predictable way. And so to get the overall, probabilistic effect, what you do is you run it loads and loads of different times, and each time use the different starting number, and so you would have a different sequence. But in order to, if you want to then go and look at that, what you're going to want to do is say, right, well, start with each of these random numbers, and it'll give you exactly the result that it gave you before. And so that allows you to step through. And if you find a scenario, for example, that does something weird, possibly because of a bug, then you can find that exact one, use the starting seed and run it through, find the place where it does the weird thing, see what that weird thing is. That's an extremely long-winded way of basically saying that it sounds like Factorio doesn't have that capacity, that you can't set the starting seed, because that would be a way of fixing that problem basically, because you would be able to say, right, well, if the spawner generates a Wriggler instead of a Stomper or whatever or a Strafer, then on this random seed it will do that, and on another random seed it will not do that. So let's force it to use that random seed. But it sounds like Factorio doesn't have that capacity. You can't fix the random seed. Or if it does, that wasn't really maybe that had some other consequence and then Erendel couldn't use that. But it's interesting that it doesn't do that. From a bug fixing point of view, you'd probably expect that it would be able to do that. It's also fascinating that the recording code and the application code change that random seed. I wonder what they would be doing that would cause that. Because if it's not making a code to the random number generator, it's not going to change it. The biggest thing to sort out was the player getting off track. It was obvious that this sort of thing can happen easily because if a gliding Wriggler hits, it slows movement. When dodging the gliding Wrigglers, there are a lot of near misses, so it results in a lot of variability. Any change to player movement also affects where the enemies go, so the whole combat could get dragged off to an unexpected direction. So we'll discuss it later, but it's, I hadn't realised from the original video that Wrigglers slow you down. But basically the point is that if the character is ever so slightly different in its position for whatever reason, particularly if the thing's been fired at a different time, because the code that the enemies are going through is different, because it's started in an ever so slightly different spawn position because of RNG, and it's come down and it's fired its Wriggler at a different time, then in the original combat, say it happened at 31 seconds or something, that's when it took a hit, that could happen at 34 seconds or 39 seconds or 24 seconds. You know what I mean? And so then if the recorded player WAS control sort of thing is based on, it's a bit like that thing where you're hit by a load of slowdown from the acid and you try and push through. You just try and move forwards in that direction, but because you're slow, you're only moving a short distance, so you're holding the key for a lot longer. If you didn't have that, if you replayed that key press and you didn't have that slowdown effect, you would be moving way up the screen. And so then if you then turned around, your recorded gameplay, you turned around and attacked the nest, because you'd moved up a short distance and you attacked a nest or a worm or something, if you didn't have that slowdown applied, you'd be up here, and so the nest you're attacking is out of range. So that's the type of thing that a small little change will give a very different result. And so we've got this, one of my favourite slides. It's a while since we had a juxtaposition, and I love these. But some new terrain assets were added to the map as they were completed. But this re-rolled the enemy behaviour. The pathing algorithm is picking different paths, slowing the character at different times. Wrigglers are being fired and it hits them at different times. So everything played out differently, and the character's final path looks very different. The left side then is the original movement path, which is the one Arundel originally recorded. The right side is the movement path with the same input but being slowed at different times. So this is just a recording. This is the recording of when it hit, when the key presses are done. You can actually see increasing numbers, which I assume are sort of the ticks, maybe, something like that. I don't know where the origin point is, but there's some quite low numbers here. So it's, starting off at 200s and 300s and sort of coming back and around there, and it looks like maybe going up in a loop there and coming back down and across, and so it's quite an erratic movement pattern, okay? But that exact set of key presses, when recreated, suddenly this part's the same, or it looks very similar anyway. See it going up there? That's the same. And then when it comes down here, that's pretty much the same. But it clearly takes a hit here that's different. And so this circling around bit and then going down here becomes circling around but then going that way and then going off here, basically. So they're doing the coming back. Yeah, so that coming back. But this now, for example, that diagonal up part is now there. Okay, so they're looping back round and coming back down, and because they're not doing this that far over, this bit that's loops like over the top again is now being done over here. And presumably because they've not got a slowdown effect going on, they're now moving huge great distances where they weren't before. So simply getting hit, for example, by a Wriggler in a different position is causing very different behaviour. The other thing you can note on the screen capture, I think that's a dead enemy there. I think that's a dead strafer. You can actually sort of see like skeletal structure in that looks like its head, but that's not there anymore. Yeah. So whatever was going on there, killing that enemy, has not happened, you see. So that's the type of big differences that it makes. And you can actually see the terrain is different as well. So you see how on this one there's now a tree. This is like, I think this is the meat fields that they were talking about. And that's not there on this. So the enemy is going to be doing different pathfinding because there's now a tree, basically. There's some other trees here. These look like the old, Nauvis trees that they've obviously just been using as placeholder. And they put in the proper meat fields trees. And suddenly that just causes the pathfinding to go bonkers. I love these slidey diagrams. More of those, please. My fix for this was to measure how far the character is from the intended path, and if it strays too far, then they are just forced to run in a direction to correct it. They're still slowed by whatever effect they have, but it means that they can cut corners or skip dodge maneuvers to get back on track. Tracking the player movement in this way also gives me a nice way to replace our camera system. Unlike previous videos where the camera is panning smoothly over the landscape, this video would follow the character's erratic movement. Our old Bezier control point system for camera movement would be a nightmare to match the character movement, especially if it ever needed to be re-recorded, which is almost guaranteed. So what it means by the Bezier control point system is, I can just show you the wiki actually. So basically when you do Bezier, I've got damage one up because we'll talk about that in a minute, but when you do a Bezier curve, it's basically like, these types of equations where you're basically creating a smooth curve between 2 points using a formula, essentially. So you see that's quadratic and linear and cubic. And basically what you can do with it is basically you define some points, so you define that point, and that point, and then it draws a curve between them. Because there are almost, I think there are technically, in maths terms, infinite curves that could pass between all three of those points. And so you need some way of just doing a nice curve. So you use this system and you can obviously implement it as an algorithm and it just does the maths for you. And so what they were doing with the camera on their camera system is essentially defining these points, and then it would draw, the code itself would work out a curve, and that was the curve the camera would follow. Okay, so it's just a nice way. And then tiny little tweaks, all you need to do is say, it's a bit off here and I want it a bit further there, so you just move that point in and it'll draw a new curve for you and you don't have to worry about it. It's very similar. It's how when you draw curves in things like vector programs and stuff like that, it's very much doing the same thing. And on those you would also have controls on the angles basically, or the aggressiveness, shall we say, of the curving a particular point, and get into all sorts of fine-tuning stuff. But basically a Bezier curve is just a way of defining in code the curve rather than having to say, because what the other alternative would be, you would say the exact points where you want it to go, and then it follows that point and it just steps between them. That would be really, really tedious to set up. And so simply being able to say, it's gone too far over here, I'll move that point in, done. So that's the old system they were using. And so, Erendel basically put in a new system. My new system takes the log character positions from the performance capture and smooths out that path with a few passes of a relax filter, essentially making each point the average of the point before and afterwards. This gives us a nice smooth camera movement, but it doesn't follow the action very well because it's always centered on the character. Then I added a secondary target system where an imagery point could move to a targeted enemy and the camera would stay some percentage between the smooth path and the secondary target point. It uses an imaginary point and not the enemy itself, so if the enemy dies and a new target is chosen, the camera doesn't suddenly jump. Instead, the imaginary point moves to the new target with a limited speed. An extra layer of controls can determine how strongly the camera is pulled to the secondary target. At the start of the video, the secondary target is the egg raft, but the influence is set to 0. So you've got the egg raft here, and what you could do with this new system is say, actually, I want you to focus on this, okay? And so the camera would actually pan up to there, even though the movement path is based on where the engineer is going. That's actually better because the camera has clearly been pulled over to this strafer, because it's no longer centered on the player, it's centered some point between. And what the Erendel system does is essentially allows you to strengthen that or not. So if you really wanted to zoom in on the big stomper as it came in, it would, you could set that to 100% focus and it would move over, watch the stomper for a bit, maybe follow that, and then move back to the player. So it's like in a film where it shows you, you've got your hero comes along and then the Balrog comes out of the lava sort of thing out of the bowels of the earth, and so the camera pans up and shows you gigantic Balrog, be afraid, and then pans back to heroes for their reaction. And so that's the type of thing you can do. This next image here, the caption says, all our debug data enabled. Smooth primary camera path in blue, secondary target path in orange, actual camera result in white. The purple squares are the camera bounds. You can always hear my voice going in these videos, because it's hours and hours of talking. All the positions and timings are more important than usual because everything in the combat is choreographed to the music. The Eggraft dies just before the beat kicks in. The strafer dies when there's a melancholic tone and the music starts to sound a bit more unhinged. And the stomper needs to die at a specific time too. More on that later. Along the way, I got to learn what would change the scenario result and how enemies would be affected. Enemies behave constantly as long as nothing changes. Swapping out a graphic is fine, but changing the graphic shift is not. I'm not sure what graphic shift means. I assume that means position, changing the graphics position. Moving an enemy, adding or removing a tree, changing a tile, adding some ammo to the character, even adding a decorative, all break the result. It can break in a lot of different ways too. The spawner, Eggraft, may or may not spawn a unit, or if they do, it could be a different type of unit. One time it randomly spawned a stomper, so there were 2 stompers. That didn't go well. The scenario is part of a mod with a set of scenarios for videos. So to fix this problem, I updated the scenarios mod so that spawners can only spawn Wrigglers. So they're doing the camera thing via a mod rather than as part of the base code. And so to stop it spawning in other things, it can only spawn Wrigglers and presumably put then the actual stompers and spawners on, strafers rather on the map. Any of the pentapods could wander off in a random direction. So if combat starts, they might be out of range of the call for help and just never show up in the combat. Never work with children, animals or pentapods, I guess. I tried to teleport the enemies to the correct spot just before they'd be in camera view, but I quickly found that you can't teleport the leggy enemies. They rubber band back to their previous position in one frame. Oh, okay. I guess that's because the bit that he's teleporting is maybe the body, and the way the legs work is they've got a separate thing. You know, they've got a separate like marker to say where, because in this video, you see this square. I'm wondering if that's the marker point of where the actual leg is, you know, currently located. And then if they were to let it go, that would jump to where, you know, where the actual point is. So if you try and move the pentapod by teleporting it somewhere else, then you would move probably the body, and so its legs would all be sort of, you know, where they're meant to be, and so the code would just go, nah, stick it back where it needs to be. Interesting. Instead, I had to spawn the pentapods to the correct position via Lua scripting just before they're in camera view. This kept positions more consistent, but script spawned leggy pentapods had a 50-50 chance of having a left or right strafing bias, meaning they'd go in a random direction. As with other things, the direction was only consistent as long as nothing changed. This was the most awkward problem because their direction impacts so much of the fight. There was never a great solution to this, but there are only 8 outcomes of left-right combinations for the 3 leggy enemies, but really the most significant direction is the first strafer. With the other consistency safety nets, it was enough to make sure that the first strafer has a consistent direction by subtly adjusting its starting position until it rerolled the direction I wanted. So it's not really a random direction, is it? But because they do this strafing behaviour where they circle the enemy, it's not consistent, and that would make sense if you were, you know, designing it as a combat foe. But these guys, so when they see strafing around its target, it clearly picks a direction at the start, because this is what they were saying in the last one about it gets locked into that strafing behaviour, and that's how you can kill it, basically. That if you had a turret here and it's strafing around you, then it's not going to realise there's a turret there until it starts getting killed by the turret, and it can get killed before it can change direction because they're slow to turn. So basically, once it's locked into that strafing behaviour, it does that. But of course, he's recorded the combat based on it doing, say, a clockwise strafe rather than an anti-clockwise strafe. So if it picks anti-clockwise, it all goes wonky. It wasn't until much later that I discovered the worst offender of messing up the scenario simulation outcome. Even the change in camera script code to go from preview mode to render mode for saving screenshots is enough to break the scenario output. Wowza. That meant that all the time spent previewing what would happen was useless because it didn't work out the way the preview showed. This catch didn't get noticed immediately because the first few times I went through the process, the render results wasn't noticeably different. But inevitably, at some point, it became a huge problem. Fortunately, I found that I could leave rendering on all the time, but reduce the capture size to 1 pixel by 1 pixel. So even though it's still saving files, they're so tiny that it's really fast, and that's good enough for a preview. What I'm interpreting that to mean is the code that's doing the screenshotting from the rendering, that's capturing the actual video, I guess, was impacting the results. So this is coming back to that thing of I don't know why these things would be in codes that's affecting the RNG, but it depends how they're doing the RNG. That clockwise, anti-clockwise selection that the strafer is making is being affected by whether the renderer is doing its thing. But it doesn't matter whether it's doing the full screen or just one pixel of the screen. So presumably the renderer is very performance intensive because it's like it's taking a picture, a proper picture each time so that you could make a video. It's not being recorded via OBS, which would be another option of recording it with an outside thing. Rather than taking the full screen capture of the full thing, it can take one pixel and that has the same impact in terms of what the code's doing. Whatever the problem that was happening is recreated even if it's just doing the one pixel. So in other words, instead of having to do the full picture and being a massive performance hog and therefore not allowing you to preview the video, if you just chop it down to the one pixel, it records basically a useless file, but the code that's going on is still the same. And so you can see whether what the result is with the renderer running. The weapon inputs capture records the time of firing, the position to fire at, and the gun to use. For Wrigglers, it's okay. The aim assist chooses nearby enemies, so inaccuracy still works. For rockets versus strafers, though, the position would be so wildly wrong that the rockets would usually target a Wriggler, often not fire at all, and only very occasionally attack the intended target. To fix that, I edited the input data to remove all rocket firing and instead used my event system to fire a rocket at the strafer directly, and in a way where it's easier to change the times to make sure there's a strafer in range. With the flamethrower, there's no target locking, but for the first use versus Wrigglers, it's always worked just fine. It's near the start of combat, so it's more consistent, and they're all being led into a kill funnel anyway. In the last use against the Stomper position was very unreliable. It would always be somewhere near the character, but the angle could be in any direction. Firing, based on its original position, looked very wrong in most cases because the flames would be going in a seemingly random direction. Once the flame dance has started, it got more consistent because I stayed in a small area and just spreading flames in a circle made more sense. To fix the start of this sequence though, I added a script to make the flamethrower target the Stomper's position for the first 2 seconds and then switch back to captured input, just a bit of smoke and mirrors. Again, move the target to the actual thing and have the flamethrower shoot there rather than just the whole character is pointing in this direction and pressing space. The next problem is the timing of when the Stomper dies. The Stomper needs to die before the end of the music, but not so far before that nothing is happening for a few seconds. For the aircraft it's easy, just shoot it at the correct time. With the strafers it's down to the rocket timings, but sometimes they're out of range, but if that's delayed by a few seconds it's okay. For the Stomper, the death time is really hard to control. In the performance capture, I got the timing just right with some practice, but in playback the timing is always off. It's usually too late because extra Wrigglers get in the way, or the flamethrower misses more. The final fix for this is just to multiply the thing's health by 10 and use a script to insta-kill it at the correct time. Health bells are hidden away, so that's why those were gone. The approximate damage inflicted by that point is still roughly enough for it to die if it had the correct health so it doesn't look wrong. That's actually part of the strategy for spinning around with the flamer at the end. It ensures that there's some fire doing damage so that it doesn't die while it's not taking damage. Okay, so the whole ending, the whole death is a cheat, basically. So it's actually got way more health than the real one. But because Arundel's recorded the video and knows, how much fire damage it takes to kill it, without that, the amount of flame and stuff that's being thrown around is a good match to the amount of damage. It's just that damage is irrelevant to the health that it's got. But Arundel knows when they want it to die. So basically, it's just a kill. And this whole bit at the end where there's just flame being lobbed all over the shop. And particularly this bit, I would guess, where it's like the celebratory bit where Arendel's just sort of throwing it around. This is like a covering thing. So this is basically, has it died at exactly the right moment? And am I firing the flamethrower at the right point? Yes, no. Just lob a load of fire around to make it look like the engineer is celebrating. But of course, if it was still there, it would look like that it's still being flamed at, basically. Interesting cheat. There's then repeats of the videos. These next two are really informative, if I'm honest. I am going to blow them up and do them on the full screen, but they do have audio, so we'll just read the captions out first. The same scene as the original combat video, but enemy health bars are shown, and it's day for clarity over atmosphere. The Stomper death time is not scripted, so this time it dies slightly too early, but re-rolling the things could make it die too late. The character happens to survive this time, but that doesn't always happen. Okay, yeah, so we'll watch this video, and it does have audio, as I say, and the audio is actually quite useful, because one of the things I was saying about the original video was about how you couldn't tell when like the stomp hits happened, and this has them. It also shows the health bars, okay, so we'll watch this through. Okay, so what does that tell us? Basically, one of the things is that there's a lot of noise in this, as in sound effect noise, because this doesn't have the video on. I can't really play it to you at the same time, but for example, so when it first starts zapping the nest, this actually lets out like a cry. I can't play it because it would double record it, basically. You'd be able to hear it twice and it would sound very weird. But basically it makes like a screaming noise when it first starts hitting it. That presumably is like the call to defense. So that is the I'm being attacked, defend me. One of the things that's interesting with the old missiles is you can hear them flying in, the Wrigglers, you can hear them as they, there's like a whooshing noise of them flying, but they're also... there's like an impact sound. All of this is a bit lost on the original video. The other thing that was really interesting is you can actually tell when the stomp attacks are happening from the audio. I hope they put something in that's a bit bassier. Again, I can't really play it to you because you get it twice and it will sound horrible. But if you watch it yourself and notice that it doesn't make us... there's like a tap noise. And I say, I hope we get something a bit beefier, a bit sort of bassier. But when it stomps, when it does the stomp attack, there's like a tap, basically. So it doesn't make that noise every time it puts its foot down. It only makes it when it's clearly trying to attack the player. And that was one of the things that was missing for me, because I couldn't tell from that original video, when is it actually hitting the player? When is it attacking the player? When is it causing damage to us? And will we get some kind of indicator on that? Because visually there doesn't appear to be much of a... if it does do, if it does do an animation to show it, hitting the ground, I can't really tell what that is. And so you at the least need some audio cue to say that's a hit, that's a hit, that's a hit. Otherwise, you're just going to be running around and suddenly you'll fall over dead and you'll be like, well, what happened? Why did it kill me? I mean, you'll know intuitively because it clearly, stomped on you, because that's what it does. But if you can't tell that it's hitting you, you don't know. And it's like a range thing as well. At what range is it able to hit you? And that would be useful for the audio to cue you in, that it gives you that tap noise if it's a successful hit, Quite illuminating. It's also interesting to see these health bars. As it shows, it's clearly killing it off too early. So it hits there, and then the engineer is kind of throwing a load of fire around as if it was still there, and it's only this end bit. And so that's what I'm just saying about it's doing the whole flaming just around and around in a circle, because the exact point that it dies is a little indeterminate. The final problem is the character dying. In the original performance, I got to the end alive, but a lot of that was to do with dodging. When playing back the scenario, even when not running into a tree, the character had only a 25% chance of getting to the end, because it would be dodging feet that are in different places and running straight into damage sometimes. This could have been solved just by upgrading the quality of the armour or equipment, but I went with the faster approach of just keeping character health up with a script. Just for fun, let's see what happens with some larger enemies. So this video is going to play through and see what happens when you get more evolved stompers and stuff. The same scene again, but this time the enemies are more evolved. It plays out a bit differently. But yeah, the point here is that I guess these guys are so tough and so powerful that even though they're forcing the die off of the stomper at the end, and they're forcing the death of the strafers by firing the rockets and making sure they hit and all that sort of stuff, they could still only survive it 25% of the time, because the stomp attacks are clearly so powerful. And I mean, the other option, there'd be no other options. Like we saw in the equipment grid here, these are level 1, I think, aren't they? Shields, so they could put level 2 in. They could have just done a script to cheat the amount of defense and stuff, but it was just easier to have the scenario generated with the player just having infinite or near infinite health. But yeah, we'll play this one through. This is fascinating as well as to what combat against higher level pentapods is going to be like. Again, I'll play it through without commentary so that you can hear the sound effects. Okay, so I'll turn the audio off again. Again, the stomp hits from the Stompy Boy are very important, because they tell you exactly when that's taking damage, and it ties up with that whole, if you see the health bar on the player now. Before this, it does look like it's a bit tougher for the engineer. I think the Wrigglers are a little bit tougher. I don't know if they're gold ones or not. Can't really tell because of how quickly they're all moving. It looks like they are, I think, but it's a little difficult to tell. They don't seem to have a great deal of extra health and stuff. Maybe they're a bit faster, I don't know. But it's really different when you get these flying Wrigglers coming in, because these are definitely gold ones. Because that's a green one there, I think. And then this is a gold one. You see how it's bigger? Yeah, so that's one of the gold ones, and that's one of the green ones. So this is small and presumably has a smaller hit, and then it's still more alive, shall we say, when it drops to the ground and attacks the player like that. So they're obviously quite a significant more threat. Now you can't really tell because they still die pretty quick because they're just Wrigglers. But the whole rocket side of it just goes completely wonky. So as it comes in, do we see the rocket firing? You can hear it. There you go. So a rocket gets fired, was just fired there, and it's, I don't know, I presume it's just heading towards one of the strafers that's off screen, and that this one would already have been dead normally. But yeah, so both of those strafers are still perfectly alive, and not even, maybe they've taken one hit, and already, Stompers come in. Now we are doing damage to the Stomper, but, and I say watch it's already dashed in. It seems to be quicker. Actually, is that just it's the same? So yeah, so this is the green one, and I guess this is the gold one. And so it is already bigger. Look at the size of it. Because that's slightly more zoomed in, the other one. So it's bigger, and it's obviously hitting harder. If you watch the purple health bar, that's the shields, and then the normal health bar. You see that each stomp is having a really significant impact. And stompy, stompy, stomp, you're dead. Okay, so gold ones are clearly nothing to be sniffed at. You've got to have quite a lot of upgrades, I think, quite a lot of advanced stuff, be using turrets in a smart way, etc., etc. Otherwise, they're going to give you a very bad time. Creating New Life by Strangepan. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope that we offered a glimpse into what it takes to create a new enemy and the kind of effort that goes into producing exciting announcements like last week's Friday Facts. I now too have a greater appreciation for games with a wide enemy variety. Even though I had the benefit of building upon existing systems, I still had to learn the capabilities, limitations, quirks and bugs of each one, and then figure out how to make them play together nicely. Each change needed to be carefully tested so that other parts of the game didn't break or become unbalanced. Along the way, there were plenty of refactors, cleanups, bug fixes, and many pages of notes. Even so, it's obvious that the previous programmers built these systems with extensibility, performance, and sometimes code health in mind. Anyway, I think I've seen enough of these creepy crawlies to last a lifetime. I'll leave Gleba to the pentapods for now. They can have it. Besides, it's about time I check on my Volcanus factory. I've been getting a bunch of alerts from there, so I sure hope nothing is disrupting my foundries. So, does that mean Volcanus enemies next week? As always, reliably and repeatably wander over to the usual places and comment at exactly the right time, which is now. My voice is going. And I haven't done the speculation. So, a fascinating one, quite techie. So, I appreciate probably quite a few of you have skipped it and kind of come to the speculation. But I love these ones. They're absolutely fascinating how they put things together and what problems they have to fix and all that sort of stuff. In a way, it's kind of how this type of problem solving, as it were, is what you do in Factorio. So it's why that thing of software development and playing Factorio are kind of the same thing, really. Anyway, on to speculation. So my first kind of area of speculation is obviously they've done now a load of optimization that improves the walking performance, basically, of enemies and entities that walk, that have long legs and walk. So we know previously that they changed the Spidertron remote into an RTS remote. We've also seen that weird grabby arm thing, which seemed to be on something that had much longer legs. It was either flying or it was tall. Are we going to get another vehicle that has legs, basically? One of the things that we kind of questioned when they did that name change is, did that mean, say, tanks could be controlled via remote control or something like that, with changes like that coming in? Then we saw the arm thing, and it was just a case of, well, is this a new vehicle? Is this a new thing? A new remotely controllable vehicle, armour, something like that is also applicable to the RTS remote? Because the big thing was, why change it to an RTS remote? And I think this probably hints that maybe there is something that has longer legs. Now, my guess, as I say, it's something to do with that digger arm. But it could be that there is another enemy on another planet that has long legs like this. So maybe it's a 3-legged thing or a 4-legged thing, or it's just very tall, basically. And that therefore optimizing the walking code was even more important than simply Gleba, because if it's used in multiple places, multiple planets, and applies to multiple vehicles, then it would be even more important to get it optimized and enable that to happen, basically. So that's my kind of first speculation point. I don't think this really hints that there was. I did note down that there appeared to be a hint that maybe there were other multi-leg creatures, but I couldn't find the reference in the text. So I don't know. I think that was just my fevered imagination. So yeah, I think this kind of suggests that maybe there will be some other vehicle that uses legs that is controllable via the RTS remote, as it's now called. Another thing I did wonder is that they've been saying, well, the whole point of these is they render your walls useless, etc., etc. When we look at this pathfinding algorithm, we see that it is discounting, I believe, walls as steppable places. Okay. Now for biters, this is then interpreted as something it can attack. They can attack the walls themselves. They don't have to have turrets to attack. They can just attack those, although it will try and do pathfinding around first. What I'm wondering, and it's maybe a practicality thing that prevents it, but certainly earlier on, your Gleba enemies, your pentapods, particularly the small ones, have a limited step range. Everything has a limited step range. Now the red guy, the red stompy boy, appears to be so big that this is probably impractical. But what you could do is have incredibly thick walls. So although walls are meant to be rendered useless, if you go the opposite way and have, 20 tile thick walls, and you could augment them with pipes and stuff like that, which are cheaper. I mean, that would be the other way. You could just have 20 tile thick pipes, just everywhere. They've got no fluid in them. They're just pipes. You could also tweak that to your advantage in that you could have steppable places, but they could have mines in them. Okay, you could have a really big thick wall, and because one of the problems we have with the pentapods, I think, with using something like landmines, is they can basically just step over the minefield as well. Well, if you make walls so thick and then put single tile gaps, the algorithm will go, and obviously the idea is they don't know they're landmines there, so they're meant to be traps. The algorithm will go, yep, stand in all of these points, and if each of those points has got a landmine on, particularly for strafers, that could wipe them out before they actually get across the walls. Now you do have this issue, obviously, that if it has lots of shallow seas and all this sort of stuff, you can't actually put walls around anyway. But particularly where you're growing your plants, I can imagine one tactic being, because we get this new landfill to fill out things, do that, put solid walls around your growth area. Hopefully belts will be long enough to go over, but even if they're not, it's just 1 or 2 tiles of an underground, that is a gap point. That would be a weak area. Get some turrets on that bit. But then the rest of it is just such a thick wall with so many landmines on, resupplied via, and we know we can get explosives because we've seen explosive rockets, resupplied via bots, which I'm guessing pentapod enemies don't attack, you see, because they're not aggroing on the usual things. So you've got the bots there. For strafers, that just wipes them out. For stompers, it damages them quite a lot, and then they're just the turrets close in your walls. Now that's a lot of infrastructure to put on. We did see walls on the previous Friday Facts. Not a lot of walls, but a little bit. So the bit that was missing was the stone. There didn't appear to be a source of stone, on that map. So how you make walls, I don't know. And one of the counters to that they could put in is that they could basically make it so that you can't build walls, you can't do stone on Gleba, and so you would have to import every single wall, so building massively thick walls would be difficult. But, as I say, you could use pipes instead. I mean, I suppose the pipes maybe have a step area either side, so it wouldn't work, but you could just have the odd pipe on maybe. But say, the easier way is just to have specific points where the stompers are going to have to stand that have landmines in them, and then they are guaranteed to stand on the landmines. That was just to say one of the things that occurred to me seeing this, that it's still basically excluding walls as a standing point. You can't stand on the walls, so use the walls to funnel them into a position you do want to stand, where they've got a load of landmines, basically. The next one then is this discontiguous pathfinding, which is an awfully big word, and what it means is literally not continuous. So if it's contiguous, it means it goes step by step by step by step. It just continues in a continuous path, okay? And so discontiguous pathfinding is allowing it to go over gaps, essentially. So if you imagine that this to here was too far, it couldn't step over that gap, and so there was only broken lines. Discontiguous pathfinding would be able to say, right, well, restart at that point there. So if that solid line wasn't a solid line, it would have some other way of looking at it and saying, right, well, can we clear that gap in some other way? Restart the pathfinding there. The type of reason that you would want that, I would suspect, would be for jumping enemies. If you were able to say, right, well, you don't have to have standing points that are connected by a distance that you can walk, you have some other form of locomotion, i.e. flight or jumping, then that would be a reason for having discontiguous pathfinding. So what I'm saying, in other words, I think this is basically confirming we are not getting any kind of jumping or flying biter. I know that Wrigglers in the air are flying enemies. They're not really, they're missiles. They are short range, limited flight capacity. Once they hit you, they drop to the ground, they can't launch themselves again. So although they are sort of flying, they're more like missiles. So they fly in the same way that missiles fly, which is over a very short range. A flying enemy I would take to mean, this is basically ruining my enemies video again. I honestly, I don't think I'll be able to do that video because all the points I was making are kind of either being proven or disproven. But basically, yeah, I mean, that's what I thought. I didn't think we would get jumping or biting enemies, jumping or flying enemies. And so basically the point is that they're giving modders the ability to introduce that type of enemy. They're not putting it in the base game. Well, I say that, but reviewing this in the edit, I kind of realised that what it says is that it's not in the base game. And of course the quality, elevated rails and Space Age itself are controlled as mods. So it could be the opposite. Which is to say it could be confirming that on one of the other planets in Space Age specifically, there is an enemy that uses discontiguous pathfinding. So I guess the real speculation here is that they've introduced it. What that means is kind of still up to interpretation. Just a note from the edit suite, especially given the camera freezing. Apologies for the technical issue. The next one is on the pollution. It's just a very interesting, it's this classic thing of a very interesting way of saying something. And it says that some machines that produce high amounts of pollution on Nauvis should emit no pollution on Gleba. That was what we were expecting. While machines that produce high amounts of pollution on Gleba should emit no pollution on Nauvis. Why would we want machines that produce pollution on Gleba on Nauvis? Now, I guess the bioreactor is something that we might be wanting to build on Nauvis. They've kind of said already that actually the bioreactor is really a Gleba-only building, that you can build it elsewhere, but it's not as useful because clearly the inputs it takes are the spoilable materials, so you're not going to ship a load of spoilable stuff to Volcanus, have it spoil and just be useless. You're going to turn it into plastic and ship that out, basically, or whatever. So I think basically the biochamber is pretty much restricted to Nauvis. Now you can build it elsewhere, so that might be what they're referring to, that produces these spores. But to me, the other obvious candidate is the whole agricultural arm thing, the planter, in that could be something that actually building it on Nauvis would be useful. Because if you think about it, it's one of the things we've been wondering as to whether we could use that on Nauvis. Now, I think they have said that you wouldn't be able to plant normal trees. But of course, if you can take away the problem of pentapods by doing your agriculture on Nauvis, if you can lay down the special soil on Nauvis, you can make the other stuff, you can make the plants on Nauvis, you can process them on Nauvis. And basically they are pollution free then, so biters presumably wouldn't really care about them. But also you get rid of the whole problem of the pentapods coming and eating your stuff, because pentapods aren't on Nauvis. So yeah, so this to me is a bit of an odd question of, the only buildings we've seen on Gleba are the biochamber, which I don't think is that useful off of Gleba, and the agricultural building, which could be if you can do other planting off of Gleba. It does make me also wonder, maybe to some extent, actually, the biochamber is useful off of Gleba, because if it does no pollution, then it's like a free pollution building. But I say the trouble is it seems to use Gleba type stuff, and you'd have to ship that there, and that would, half spoil or what have you. So yeah, it sounds a bit of a pain to do that. And I guess related to that is this whole thing about absorption as well, because they basically seem to be saying that, well, let's have a look. So in the previous Friday Facts, we saw how these had pretty much circular pollution patterns. So the agricultural planter and all that sort of stuff is at the centre there, and the pollution comes out in a pretty much circular way. It appears that, as I mentioned in the last Friday Facts, that the only things absorbing pollution appear to be the actual enemies, and that there's no tile absorption, basically. So these clouds just spread out, pretty much as they go. If there is absorption, then it seems to be along the lines of everything does it evenly, because what this is saying is that you now have the ability, or certainly modders do, to alter the amount of stuff that it absorbs on each tile, so whether trees and stuff. And I'm taking this to mean pretty much that Gleba plants, Gleba terrain doesn't really absorb pollution, okay? Or the local pollution. Now, whether it'd absorb it, what's not clear to me, I'm assuming it's because of the fairly obvious way in which it would be done. If you do move these things to Nauvis, because this pollution type is not on that planet, unless they have an additional stat on them to tell you what the normal pollution is, that basically, there isn't a situation where a Gleba agricultural thing is emitting a pollution, or emitting the pollen pollution, the spore pollution, and that angers biters, because they can't do it on Nauvis, if that makes sense. Effectively, it turns it off, and so the tiles aren't going to have multiple, they're not going to have a tile that has normal pollution absorption level and Gleba pollution absorption level, because it's all very surface specific is the point. So this thing here, because one of the things I haven't really, in a sense, understood or fully understood is, can you lay down normal landfill on Gleba? Because normal landfill obviously has an Actually, I don't think normal landfill absorbs pollution at all, does it? Isn't that one of the weird quirks of it? I think it is, that it can't absorb pollution. But in which case, say some of this does absorb pollution, and you stick normal landfill on, does that mean it pushes further out, because it's not absorbing anything? Or what, really? It's sort of the question of, and does the Gleba landfill, the special one, does that absorb normal pollution at all? So if you go back if you take a load of that back to Nauvis, can you use it basically to soak up pollution around your base and reduce the number of attacks? I'm assuming not, basically. I'm assuming they're sort of very much mutually exclusive ways of doing things. But the basic point was that it appears that the way they're doing this system is that the only thing that absorbs pollution is the actual enemies and nothing else. It just radiates out in a perfect circle. And obviously it gets to a point at a distance where, because you're doing that whole, it's a, what do you call it? Inverse square, is it? I can't remember. But it's that thing as, you're not moving out linearly, you're moving out in two directions. So you take 10 and divide it by 4 effectively, because it goes in 4 directions, and then you divide that by 16, and so the amount that's moved across to every single individual tile reduces, and there will come a threshold point where it basically says, right, there is nothing being moved across, because it's spread so thin that there's nothing there. And that's why you get these circular patterns. They're not just going to infinitely expand to fill the entire map, because there just won't be enough stuff to move on to the next tile. When it gets below 0.1 pollutions, that's it. It can't move any further, basically. That therefore means if you haven't got anything that can absorb the pollution, it's a bit like, so you can, in Nauvis, you can deliberately start your starting position rather, in the grass area with lots of trees, and it absorbs a load of your pollution, and therefore makes biters less of a problem. Or you can start in the desert, where it absorbs less of your pollution, there's far fewer trees, and so you have more trouble with biters early on. Because there's no pollution absorption, I think, from tiles on Gleba, it basically doesn't matter where you build. There is no, right, well, I'll build in the meatlands because that's super absorbent to pollution. It doesn't matter. You can build anywhere. It just doesn't have any effect. That might explain why this base is so small, partly, because if it doesn't matter that, it doesn't matter where you put it, then just put it as close as you close to where you start, basically, because who cares, in a sense. You're going to get attacked no matter what, and there isn't a way of building it, somewhere where no pollution can be sent out. One of the other things we do obviously now see is the loadout for when they did the combat video. As I suspected, it's pretty meaty. It's not full-on systems because these are level 1 shields, not level 2. And obviously level 2 shields give a heck of a lot more protection. One of the things I was wrong about is that it's only got the one personal laser. I guess these must have, and now that I think about it, it makes perfect sense, but I was thinking that maybe there were a couple because it was shooting out multiple beams, but I guess these have multiple, they can attack multiple targets, because there are multiple normal lasers stuck together, I think, aren't they? But yeah, we've got a couple of exo legs. We've got 2 of the fission reactors, so these aren't the fusion reactors, I say, so it's not endgame. We do have quite a lot of batteries, but these are level 1 batteries, you see, so not level 2. I still have this suspicion that, like, level 2 shields, level 2 batteries, you know, the sort of higher tier of gear is unlocked on another planet. They didn't quite say that. They said something about buffs being unlocked, or like up. Well, I think the phrasing was maybe, you know, it does mean that, but it was like, you know, improvements were unlocked on other planets. So I think maybe it is, and this was, you know, my combat video. I was talking about, you know, are shields a Fulgora thing? And so maybe that's where you get the level 2 shields, and you know, that's where all of the level 2 gear is unlocked. And certainly with obviously the fusion reactor version, which we pretty much suspect is going to be from Aquilo. But yes, so it's a pretty decent layout because it is a level 2 power armor as well. We've obviously got normal rockets, so they're not explosives. We kind of knew that because of how it was done. But we've got a flamethrower and we've got uranium ammo. So that's, you know, pretty much as powerful as the ammo gets. The other thing to note, it does actually specifically say, and this is why I had this open, was that it's level 8 damage. Level 8 gets you into the second level of the infinite techs, so it's not, you know, low levels of damage. This is pretty much high level, and I presume that also applies, you know, it'll be the laser damage as well. And so if you think about, this is the type of level that you kind of, if you're playing a normal playthrough, you're just doing the game, you know, you just wanted to launch a couple of rockets and you're done, that's the type of level you would be at. You know, you would be able to access a few physical damage improvements because you can do a few rockets. You've got the blue shields and you've got, you know, a laser thing, you've got your level 2 armor, and it's only really if you then want to go a lot further than that that you need the, you know, improved stuff. I think most players do unlock it earlier, but you don't really need it. And so that will be the level you're at, which makes sense. So the context of the video is the engineer arriving on the planet with pretty much what I can probably guess as being, this is like the maximum level you could get to on Nauvis, where you've got your best ammo for your submachine gun, you've got, you know, the level 1 of the gear, and that's it. But it is a pretty meaty loadout. There wouldn't be too much that you would be able to not deal with on Nauvis. Perhaps behemoths maybe would be a struggle, but even that I don't think so. I'd probably swap in, you know, one of these for a laser, and I think behemoths would struggle. But it interestingly doesn't have a night vision. This was one I think, because obviously the video itself goes into night, so it doesn't have a night vision on it. So yeah, they're exchanging that for an extra shield. But yeah, so that kind of confirms the level of, you know, that was being used in the video. Particularly interesting, as I say, is the uranium ammo. That is a pretty significant amount of damage that it can do, and yet it still survives a whole multiple minutes of, you know, it's being flamed on, because again, I'm assuming level 8 means that it's level 8 of the flammables damage, or that only goes to 6, doesn't it, or something. But yeah, I'm assuming it's basically most of the buffs that you would have in a normal playthrough type of thing, and it takes, you know, it's taking laser damage continuously, and then it gets hit by the flamer for multiple minutes, you know. So it's taking a lot of damage, and this is just level 1. The other thing it unfortunately confirms, and I was hoping, particularly based on some of the comments that I'd had on the last video about how the enemies would spawn essentially, and that the kind of hope was that they would evolve or grow from the previous level, so that you would, maybe the eggs spawned the Wrigglers, and then Wrigglers after a certain amount of time had a chance to turn into a strafer, and after a certain amount of time they had a chance to turn into a stomper. Doesn't look like that's the case. It looks like they just spawn, basically. So the egg rafts just spawn strafers and stompers and stuff, and that's presumably a pollution related thing, like in the base game. I'd say a bit disappointed with that. I fully understand it, because they'd be introducing a whole new system for doing it. For what real reason? You know, they've got a perfectly serviceable way of doing things, so, you know, having it use that makes sense. But a little disappointing even still. Another small detail was that it shows that the enemies the Wrigglers, when they hit you, do slow you down. You know, so when they were showing this video, you can actually see properly now that it's a bit more, you know, when the hits happen was the thing that was really difficult to tell in the last video, but with the audio, obviously I've got it turned off, but when you have the audio on, you can actually hear the splat noise, and you can actually see that the enemy that the engineer slows down when it gets hit. It also slows down in the water by the looks of things, and obviously what isn't apparent to me, it still doesn't look like the stomper, when it stomps you, like has any effect. You know, it doesn't look like that slows you down, which I would kind of want that as a way of doing it. Last little one I had then was about the death of the stomper, basically, because when it dies here, and I'm sure it's in the other video, but I hadn't really seen this, because as Erendor says, this dies like early, so it's not actually covered in as many flames. But this is the dead stomper corpse, okay? And the bit that I wanted to kind of point out, essentially, was this, because to me, that looks a bit like a biter head, okay? If you think of that as the eye, and that is like the mouth area, or maybe sort of a fish head or something like that, okay? What I wanted to point out was that, so you may remember this was the 406, and it won't let me zoom in any further than that, that's annoying. But this was the one where we saw these weird corpses on the platform, and it was like, they looked a lot like biters. Well, if the corpse bits from stompers, like that, imagine that turned like sort of orangey browny type colour because it's decayed. That seems like a fairly good match for what's on there. I say I can't really blow this one up properly for some reason. So yeah, those which I initially thought looked like biter corpses, if you look at them, they could easily be the stomper corpses, and that could confirm this thing that this platform was transporting eggs, and those eggs hatched, and out popped some stompers, and that's why it's got rocket turrets. Because this is one of the things, you know, about this. We were saying, why has it got guns at the back, and why has it got them there? I mean, it's got them here as well, which, you know, looks like it's armed from all sides. But here is a really high concentration of military might, basically. You know, it's more actually than quite a lot of the front has. And it's like so weird that you would have so much, and it's kind of centered on the cargo hub where you would expect things to come out of. So yeah, to me, this is actually saying that these weren't like placeholders, and they weren't using biters as a placeholder. Those are the actual remains of the thing. It's just that they look a bit, especially when they've gone brown, when they've gone all manky, they look a bit like that. Yeah, you could well imagine that decayed as being that corpse. And then obviously there is the other corpse, and then there you go. So again, turn it brown. Those look like a bit like eyes, and, you know, guts basically around it. Could that, you know, have also spawned on the platform? The problem with that argument is basically that it said that the Wrigglers are what spawn out of the eggs, I think. So if the corpses for the other ones were there, that wouldn't, you know, if it was a stomper corpse, that would be a bit weird. And unfortunately, the Wriggler corpses don't look kind of anything like that. Well, they didn't when I was looking at them. There are better ones earlier on, aren't there? There you go. So that's the Wriggler corpse. It really does look like a dead starfish, which the things on this, and I say I can't really show it to you because it won't let me zoom it in. The things on this don't really look like dead starfish, I would say. They do look like things with eyes, essentially. So yeah, But yeah, could that be more confirmation that this was transporting eggs for some reason and that they hatched? I hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you'd like to chat about the latest Factorio Friday Facts, you can find me live streaming Factorio every weekend over on my Twitch channel @Trismegistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers. When the five-legged pentapops